fiber friends. Welcome to the Jill and Eve channel. I'm Evie. I spin yarn and I make stuff from yarn. And today I am going to be weaving a project. This is linen. I'm making some linen cloth. American made linen cloth. Locally made linen. Except the linen's not actually local. The linen itself, product of Belgium. I have some linen that I spun myself over here on this spinning wheel. And I have some other linen around that I've spun myself, but to do this project, I needed to have a bit more quantity. And so Belgium came to my rescue. But I think I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself. There are tariffs now that we didn't have like a month ago. And, but then sometimes there's not tariffs anymore, and then there will be again tomorrow, and it's very confusing, and it's tumultuous, and in my opinion, unnecessary. I would like to talk about it because I'm seeing some interesting takes in the fiber arts community, and we have been through these sort of flashpoint topics before, where it just shows such a divide within the fiber arts community. And we have a chunk of people who say, I don't want to talk about politics, I just want to enjoy my hobby. So I'm sure you've all probably made up your mind about what side I'm going to take in this and what side you're already on, and maybe some of you are already in the comments. I mean, that's sort of been the way of things, but I would encourage you to hear me out. I'd like to tell a story about textile production in the United States, because if we are going to talk about bringing production back so that people can buy American made and shop local, we need to understand where that industry is at today. And to understand where it's at today, we need to understand where it came from, what has happened to it, where it's gone, so that we can have a educated and thorough conversation about what tariffs mean for knitters, for spinners, for crocheters, because we are a diverse and beautiful community. And there's a lot of nuance here. So, it's political today. Buckle up. I have a lot of things to say. And to start with, we are going to go back in time to 1699. In 1699, the English Parliament signed, I guess, the Wool Act. The Wool Act was meant to keep the production and sale of finished wool items within England and Wales. And it was very specifically targeted to Ireland and the American colonies, because it wasn't the United States yet. I want to acknowledge Ireland as part of that because they were also colonized, but because of just the whole topic of this discussion, I'm going to focus on the United States. What England didn't want was for American colonists to have herds of sheep, shear that sheep, spin and weave and make cloth to sell. Even if they were selling to each other in the American colonies, England wanted that business because they had built their wealth on wool. England wanted that industry income to remain theirs. So the Wool Act meant that you couldn't sell finished wool, certainly, but even just moving wool around within the colonies became illegal. And it was policed and monitored. I'm certain that there was some illicit wool smuggling taking place. I also have read stories about how, like, it was illegal to transport wool on carts or wagons from one colony to another. Like you could send it to England or Wales, but you couldn't like sell it within the colonies to the other colonies. And so people would they wouldn't shear the sheep, load up the wool and move it. They would take the entire herd of sheep to the other colony and have them sheared there. That started a lot of just home spinning. And it was even called the homespun movement. So once we get further into the 1700s and there's more tariffs, which is a tax because it was money that was charged to import things that the colonists had to pay to have those things. And then that money was going to the English government. And then, of course, the whole issue was that the colonists weren't being represented in Parliament for where that money was going or how much of that money was charged. They felt that they were just, being exploited. So during that time, it became a very patriotic thing to wear American textiles. Like George Washington on his inauguration wore a American-made wool suit. And there was a graduating class at Harvard where the entire graduating class wore American-made wool suits. And it was very patriotic to do this. One of the things that they would do, they would have spinning frolics. And I think that's fantastic. And I think we should bring back the term spinning frolics. It would be like a sewing or a quilting bee, but for spinning, so it would be a spinning frolic. People would gather together and they would spin as much linen or wool or whatever that they could. And there would even be competitions to see who could spin the most in a day. And it was a big deal. There'd be gatherings, there'd be audiences for this stuff. A lot of times they would gather at ministers' houses to do this thing, and then the ministers would give them tea, which is very exciting because they wanted their tea. What's interesting is the amount of spinning wheels to looms. There's a ratio that makes sense. Like it takes this many spinners to keep a weaver occupied, right? Because the ideal system would be that your spinner is always spinning during the time that they have set to spin. The weaver is always weaving, and with that balance, the weaver has used all of their yarn and not run out, and the spinner has used all of their time to spin and not overloaded the weaver. And what's interesting is that we have records of the stuff people had when they died. And it's very convenient, I guess, that women didn't own their own stuff. So when the man of the house died, everything was inventoried, even if it was something that was in the domestic realm of the feminine or whatever. In The Age of Homespun, Objects and Stories in the Creation of an American Myth by Laurel, Thatcher, Ulrich, she writes, probate records from Plymouth Colony show the gradual development of household production in southern New England. Before 1649, only 15% of estates listed spinning wheels. By 1660, that had risen to 40% as entries like 2 blankets being homemade began to appear alongside English textiles. This one's interesting because this is probably one of my ancestors, but I haven't looked into the family tree, but my the maiden name on my mother's side is Winslow. They did come over on the Mayflower, so that side of the family has been here a very long time. Josiah Winslow of Marshfield owned just the half of 23 yards and an half of homespun cloth at the Fullers. This reference to homespun cloth at the Fullers is intriguing since this is a bit of a rabbit hole. In English usage, homespun was usually defined as a coarsely woven, unmilled fabric. In America, the words homespun and homemade were used interchangeably. A lot of the cloth was specifically labeled English cloth because people still had to buy English cloth because there wasn't the infrastructure to support fully homespun, American-made textiles at that time. yes, people were making their own stuff. But no, it wasn't enough to supply their whole entire household. Another interesting thing is that before the push to the homespun patriotism, a lot of people weren't spinners. Like, they didn't need to be, because they could just buy what they needed. And so there are things that mention that people at that time, women at that time, were, learning the spinning from their grandmother or mother or whatever. Like, there was a indication that these were people who hadn't come up as children learning, that they were picking it up as adults as part of this patriotic movement. I find that fascinating. That said, that's specifically referencing spinning. These are people who absolutely would have known how to sew. They would have done a lot of sewing. They would have known how to tailor things to fit. They would have done a lot of the hand work required to supply their wardrobes. But like, when you look at the hours it takes to make a dress, and then you look at the hours it takes to make the cloth to make the dress, the amount of hours, the amount of labor is vast. It takes a lot of time and a lot of work. Like, these people still had to eat. They had other stuff going on. They had farms to take care of and manage. They had other needs for their communities that required their time. Even at a time that we kind of romanticize as the patriotic, make it from scratch, people still weren't doing everything from scratch. And also on top of that, as we know from the spinning frolics, there was a lot of community involvement and community cooperation to get things done. Something that we don't have a lot of today. For me, creating, it's not because I'm going to sell what I make. I'm going to use what I make. The investment in my time into this craft is to maintain the knowledge of this craft so that it can be accessible to those who want to pursue and experience it and enjoy it. You can tell me what yarn you want and I can spin it. And that is a skill, right? I've had hours and hours and hours of practice to accomplish that. And so for me to sell yarn, it cannot compete with the prices of imported yarns or even domestic mill spun yarns, which we're gonna get to, even with tariffs. There are some people who do choose to sell what they make, and that's totally fine. For most people, it's either a side hustle or to supplement something else they do, or they have a spouse with a breadwinner income. And so they can have, the lesser income to pursue doing that, but they couldn't do that if that was their sole income, if that makes sense. There will be exceptions. I'm sure there's someone out there who is absolutely slaying the craft festivals and making bank with their hand spun yarns, but generally that's not the market that exists, and it hasn't existed in a very long time, if ever, in the United States. Let's move right along. We are gonna zip through the American Revolution. Now we're moving into the 1800s. Industrialization has fully been underway in England. A man named Slater worked in some of the mills in England and learned how they worked, how they functioned. He memorized the machinery, and then he came to the United States and explained how to put a mill together, and they built one. And he was called Slater the Trader in England because that was literally corporate espionage. I mean, it's before corporations, but you get what I mean. That was espionage because now in the United States, they could build their own mill, right? And make their own textiles, which competed with England. And then we've got, cotton coming from the South in the United States. So we are going to build a mill. Lowell was another one who was building a cotton mill at this time, but I think Slater's was the very first cotton mill. But all of this was taking place in Lowell, Massachusetts. So who are the workers in these very first cotton mills? And, you know, why would they want to work in a mill like this if they happen to have read anything by Charles Dickens? Well, the American revolutionaries, the young men and women who were American revolutionaries in the American Revolution, they had children, and then they had grandchildren. Those grandchildren, maybe great-grandchildren, were the first employees of the cotton mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. These are the granddaughters of the American Revolution, literally. The idea was that they could go and work in the mill, and there would be some education for them there, and that there would be codes of moral conduct, and there would be house mothers to ensure that those codes of moral conduct were followed. And just a note on that, these were specifically white women. For that reason, they wanted them to remain respectable and marriageable in polite society, and so they were specifically white women. I just wanted to mention that at these mills. I think I broke a warp. I did break a warp. Time to splice. So the idea was that they would go and work for a time and make some money and then go off to get married. This, if you think about it, was not that different than what was going on before, where they would hire out services to go and spin for, you know, a farmer who had lots and lots of sheep and fleeces that needed to be spun, or they had purchased cotton for their own home use, and they would hire local girls to spin that for them. And, you know, during young teenage years, that was a very normal thing for these girls to do. And so for them to go to a mill where they're essentially doing the same activity to make money, spinning, weaving, conceptually, like, it's the same thing, plus they're chaperoned and supervised. And on top of that, can you imagine being from a small farm and then for the first time seeing a textile mill? Like, that would have been as revolutionary as, you know, the first time people were logging on to AOL, or, you know, like the idea of the technology that now exists that we have access to. It must have just absolutely been mind-blowing. So while these girls were there working in Lowell, they did have self-improvement circles, places where former farm girls could discuss literature, art, and philosophy after attending lectures from the likes of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. They also started their own literary magazine called the Lowell Offering. It was run by and written by these young girls who were working in the mills. The first all-female run and written journal or literary magazine in the United States. And you can access the entire digital archive. I will link it in the description below. Harvard has the entire thing online and you can access all of it. I have spent quite a lot of time reading it, but like for my background, another rabbit trail, I'm sorry, it'll be brief. I taught language arts, I've taught English, and reading it, knowing the age of these girls that were writing it and having graded essays, I'll just say it's fascinating. Especially if you're a teacher, go check it out. Amazing stuff. Absolutely amazing stuff. But also, what's interesting is that the publication started off as a collection of lighthearted poems and essays, but as time went on and conditions inside the mills deteriorated, notes of dissatisfaction and even rebellion crept into its pages. The shift in tone was thanks in no small part to Sarah Bagley, a talented weaver turned firebrand labor activist. Federal workers had won a 10-hour workday in 1840, and skilled workers in various industries had done the same years earlier, but the mill girls were still working up to 16 hours a day for paltry wages, and they were sick of it. 16 hours a day, and they were fighting for a 10-hour workday. And so they all just up and walked out, and they said, "You can't run the mill without us. Give us a 10-hour workday." And on top of this, they're contributing to their own literary journal and trying to educate and improve themselves with guest speakers. And I don't know, something about that touches me. Mill owners have always tried to make more money on the backs of their workers. And in 1834, mill managers in Lowell cut worker pay by 12.5% and ordered boarding houses to begin packing 8 women into each room. 8 women in a single room. So hundreds of women workers walked out, but the owners were able to quickly crush the strike. More and more public sentiment was understanding that, like, these young girls are being worked to death, and they're crammed in these rooms, and there was just less esteem for the work of going to a mill to work. And so as actual working conditions were starting to become known publicly, mill bosses reacted with alarm and sent their agents, who would go and bring workers further and further afield to lure impoverished young women into their employ. One Portland, Maine newspaper lamented that there are hundreds of young females shipped from every state every year to the factory prison houses, like cattle, sheep, and pigs sent to slaughter, in the polluted and polluting manufacturing towns where they are prepared for a miserable life and a horrible death in the abodes of infamy. I just have to say that this repeats when other countries industrialize and they need workers. They go further out and they prey on young girls who are impoverished. They lure them with the, idea of making money for their family, and they bring them to these mills where they're housed and they work and they labor in these mills, and they have no access to their family to return home. The exploitation of the labor force is part of industrialization, as we've seen it expressed in all of the places that it has come to exist. These American women are, having their walkouts and demanding better wages and less hours, and, maybe to not have so many girls sleeping in one single room. The mill owners said, fine, we'll just hire someone else. And they did. And so what they started to do was hire immigrants. The first batch of immigrants that were hired to replace the granddaughters and great-granddaughters of the American Revolution, the first batch of immigrants that were the replacement were Irish immigrants, because there were thousands of Irish immigrants coming to the United States because they were literally starving. This was the time of the Great Famine in Ireland, just all of the colonization that they had experienced there. They were willing to work the terrible hours and pack lots of girls into a single room. They were willing to put up with that situation and those conditions because at least they weren't starving. At least they had food. That was the beginning of the industrialization of textiles, and that was where immigrants are taking our jobs started, and that was where people started to feel that they were disempowered because someone else could replace them. It was an early foreshadowing of conflicts that would be seen time and time again in the American labor struggle. Different groups of marginalized workers were pitted against one another as profit-obsessed business interests scrambled to hire the most vulnerable people they could get their hands on. The Irish would be followed into the mills by workers from Quebec, from Greece, from Germany, from Russia, and Poland, and Italy, and the Netherlands, and Croatia, and many others. Each new group of immigrants arrived eager to work, unaware that they would soon be ground up by the mills. So why was anybody working there? Why wouldn't they go get a different job where they could be outside and maybe not inhale fibers from the textiles that could cause brown lung disease, the textile version of black lung disease, which was what the coal miners would experience. Sarah Bagley wrote, "Whenever I raise the point that it is immoral to shut us up in a room 12 hours a day in the most monotonous and tedious employment, I am told that we have come to the mills voluntarily and we can leave when we will." Voluntarily, Bagley raged in print, "The whip which brings us to Lowell is necessity. We must have money. A father's debts are to be paid, an aged mother to be supported, a brother's ambition to be aided, and so the factories are supplied." Side note, the brother's ambition to be aided. There were many girls that wrote about working so that they could pay for their brother to go to college, university. And so the factories are supplied. Is this to act from free will? Is this freedom? To my mind, it is slavery. I want to keep talking about this, and I don't want to fix this broken warp right at this moment, so I'm going to put this aside. While I was scooting my loom over, I remembered I was going to talk about this. This is a shuttle that would be used in a industrial loom. I have a couple of them. So this comes up, the pern, which is the bobbin that holds the yarn, slides onto there. If your job in the mill is to load the shuttle when it's empty, to put another pern on there so it's got more weaving yarn, you have to get the thread through that itty bitty hole right there, and then it has to come out over here on the side. As it goes back and forth, it is unraveling, you know, and it's being pulled off the end. What girls would do is they would put their mouth on it and suck, because they would suck the thread through, and then it was much easier and faster than, you know, finding a hook and running a hook in there. Like I get it. If you look, because this is coming out here, but then it has to go around this nail and then out the other side. So you couldn't just hook through this side, you'd have to bring it here first and then here. Anyway, the act of sucking the thread through to thread the shuttle, it was called the kiss of death, because one girl with tuberculosis could infect everybody else in the weaving room, because multiple girls would be putting their mouths in the same spot. Not to mention inhaling the dust, which would aggravate the lungs, which wouldn't be good if you had tuberculosis anyway. And so many girls were sick, died, and that's why it began to be called the kiss of death, because at some point they realized that's not a good idea. Keep your mouth off that. Use a threading hook. And it's interesting because on the shuttle, I don't know if you can see, but there's sort of a different wear to the wood around the threading hole. I don't know if you can see. Possibly from mouths being on there. Maybe. Kiss of death. What should I work on next? I've actually been finishing a lot of projects and I don't have a lot of stuff to work on next, so let's just hang out. At this point, we start to get into the labor movement in the 1800s and then up into the early 1900s. And the point of the labor movement was that collectively the workers had more power against the well-financed, wealthy owners of the mills. One very notable strike that took place was in 1912. It was the Lawrence textile strike. People were barely on the survival edge of not starving, and to have their wages cut meant now we starve. And so the choice to strike, which means starving, or to continue laboring and also starving, but at a slower pace, people were literally putting their bodies on the line. So the police were there not to enforce the safety of the citizens, but to enforce the desires and wishes of the mill owners. And their desires and wishes were for people to not have unions, because there was power, there was collective power that people had. They could shut down the mill. I'm bebopping in here while editing to talk about this guy, Mr. Wood.
He was a classic rags to riches story, and he didn't do anything to help his fellow workers, even though he started working in the mill. He was a millionaire, and he got a lot of that money accumulated because he bought up nearby struggling mills. So then he owned all the mills in a trust, and he could set his prices however he wanted. He also had influence in Congress, and Congress was routinely passing tariffs so that he couldn't be undercut by foreign wool sellers. And so the prices of his wool were very high. None of that money was going to the employees. And this robber baron behavior is why we have things like antitrust laws and why we protect workers' rights to unionize, to collective bargain, because up against this kind of money, it's just what they have to do. Also, heads up, we're about to talk about some police violence. So if you don't want to hear it, go ahead and skip forward.
There's stories about, there's a story about a woman who was leaving a union organizing meeting and she was beaten by the police. She was beaten unconscious and then she miscarried. There's stories about a man who was bayoneted, I believe because he was wearing a union pin, identifying him as part of a union. People were really brutalized, and that was accepted. Who do you go to? The police? They're the ones that are causing the violence. And so the labor of these laborers, the blood, sweat, and tears of these people, I think it can't be understated the situation that they were in and the risks and sacrifices that they made to have decent working hours. So the Lawrence textile strike was interesting because there were so many different immigrant groups and there were so many people speaking different languages. So at the union meetings, they would have interpreters. So they would find someone who spoke, Italian and French, and then they would have someone who spoke German and French, and then they had someone who spoke English and German, and they would coordinate it so that it was like they could hear the instructions or the rah-rah speeches or the, whatever needed to be said at these organizing meetings, right? And then it would be like a chain of interpretation so that everybody could be on the same page. Coordinating that, I just think that's incredible. And it was the dead of winter, and the strike was going on. Everyone was starving, but especially children were starving. And the image of these starving children brought sympathetic families to offer to take the children in and house them and feed them until the strike was over. And so mothers would put their children on trains and send them to other towns and cities like New York, where they would go to a family that would look after them and feed them. Big turning point in this strike happened when these mothers were taking their children to the train station and the police came and beat these women and their children to prevent them from sending the children away. And the image of the police beating these women and children really brought public sympathy to support the strike. One of the signs that they held up said, "Give us bread, but give us roses too." And the whole point of that was like, yes, we need to eat. Like, we need to live and survive, but we also need dignity. This was referred to as the Bread and Roses strike. And I just think that that's such a moving sentiment said in such a simple way. Dignity is important. This was just barely over 100 years ago in this country. And I want to acknowledge that this is happening like in other countries. There are places where if people walk out and demand better wages, they are beaten until they return to work. This is part of capitalism and industrialization. Like, this is just how it works. There was a project to document the children that were working in these mills, and the photographs, you can access those on the Library of Congress has them all digitized, and you can search that collection. It's incredible. And just looking at the faces of these young children who aren't going to school, they're going to work in a mill. And OSHA didn't exist, and the danger of working around this equipment. So many had maiming injuries. They lost fingers and limbs and could die. I mean, imagine one of these things, right? The speed at which these were going back and forth. It's called a fly shuttle because it would fly so fast. Now look at the brass tip on this. Imagine what happens if this comes flying off a loom and strikes you, right? Like, this could kill a person. This is a little missile. And it did. It did. Girls would get their hair caught in the machinery. There was one girl that she was entirely scalped when her hair was caught in the machinery, and they were able to reattach her scalp, and she survived amazingly. And she went to Congress because Congress was like, how bad is it? And so they specifically took children who had maiming injuries to show, look, this is what is happening to our nation's children, because there's no protection for them. And so laws were passed, and, we had children going to school and staying in school instead of having to go work and labor. That was good for the kids. And we started to have more and more regulations that were to keep people safe so that they could keep their fingers. And, not succumb to things like tuberculosis from the kiss of death, and brown lung disease, where the tiny fibers would lodge in people's lungs and cause chronic and sometimes mortal diseases because of that. I think there are certain people, when they say "Make America Great Again," they are thinking of the Gilded Age, and they envision themselves as a robber baron. And at that time, that's pre-union stuff. That's when people were exploited for their labor. That's when children were working in mills. That's when, people were horribly maimed and there was no compensation for them.
A bill is advancing in the Florida legislature that would remove current child labor protections for 16 and 17-year-olds. From member station WFSU, Tristan Wood reports their employers could require them to work full-time and even overnights on school days.
Supporters say the bill would allow parents and families to make decisions about their children. Critics are saying it's coming up now to make up for labor shortages in the state due to crackdowns on immigration. They're pointing to these comments Florida Governor Ron DeSantis made at an immigration roundtable last week.
Why do we say we need to import foreigners, even import them illegally, when, teenagers used to work at these resorts? College students should be, all this stuff.
Loosening child labor protections has become a growing trend in recent years, with over a dozen states reducing their protections. It's unclear if this bill has the votes to pass. Another event that led to a lot of regulations and safety being implemented was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. A shirtwaist is like shirt that you wear under a jacket, and so this was mostly young women who were sewing the shirt that goes under the jacket, shirtwaist. And so the owners locked the doors because they didn't want these people to steal thread or needles or maybe have a breath of fresh air. And they were high up on a high floor in a tall building in New York City. And the building caught on fire. And they were trapped because the shirtwaist factory owners had locked the doors. And they couldn't get out. And over 145 people died. Many of them were Jewish and Italian immigrants. It was horrific because they were jumping out of the windows as the flames were behind them. Like, they could burn alive or they could jump.
and their bodies were just like laid out on the sidewalk, and people from all around were witnessing this thing happening. They had these pictures in the newspaper. So it was an event that caused public outrage and impacted the safety of future workers. But again, these are people who died for the protections that we have now. After the shirtwaist fire, the families, sued the owners because their loved ones had died because the doors were locked. So the shirtwaist factory owners were absolved of all charges. It was like, it's not your fault, but you should still compensate these families. I just looked it up because I wanted to get this right. They were absolved of all charges. They were ordered by the court to pay compensation in the amount of $75 per deceased victim. But they got $60,000 from their insurance. That means that they made $325 per death. So that's not really any incentive to unlock the doors for next time, is it? But that tragedy is, reasons why we have fire exits and we can't have blocked doors and safety measures so that people aren't trapped by fire like that. These are hard-won victories paid for with people's lives. So, there was a time when the unions were successful, workers had protections, they could go to work, they could work a day and be paid and go home and have enough money to buy a house and a car and take their family on vacation once in a while. And have a life of dignity. They had their bread and they had their roses too. And then things started to change. As we move into the 20th century and we get into the 1980s, the manufacturing and production went overseas, but it was still owned by United States companies. So again, they're just looking for cheaper labor. That has not changed, and it probably will not change. So I'm gonna read just a little bit from this book. It's called Worn: A People's History of Clothing by Sofi Thanhauser. Incredible book, powerful book. Not for the faint of heart. U.S. corporations and the U.S. State Department have worked together over decades to bring cheap garments to American consumers, framing job creation as a blessing, while simultaneously engaging in political interventions to keep citizens poor. In the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan moved to confront what he saw as a rising threat to U.S. interests, a communist drift in the Caribbean basin, his two-pronged strategy was to consolidate U.S. military hegemony over the region and to encourage the growth of export processing. He launched the Caribbean Basin Initiative, CBI, which granted military aid and one-way duty-free access to the United States market for a designated range of products. Which kind of reminds me, in a way, of the Wool Act of 1699, where it's okay, we're in charge of you, now you can only send your stuff to us. So in the early 1980s, as offshore labor was becoming less and less expensive, garment industry in the United States was struggling to compete, especially with Asian countries, and so they started to contract out or just straight up move out to places like Honduras, where they could make goods at more competitive prices because they're skirting, minimum wage and safety regulations and things like that. Textile firms in the U.S., meanwhile, saw that garment factories in the region could absorb their cloth at a time when struggling U.S. garment manufacturers were buying less and less. In 1984, the year that the Caribbean Basin Initiative first went into effect, United States textile corporations, apparel firms, importers, and retailers began lobbying to loosen import quotas and reduce tariffs in the Caribbean Basin. They added an important caveat. If U.S. markets were to be thrown open to clothing sewn in the Caribbean Basin, they had to be made with U.S. cloth, and so they kept some production in the United States. Asian suppliers of garments to the U.S. market, like Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan, began subcontracting into the Caribbean Basin to get around the quota restrictions and limitations. So, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, because this is like really detailed, specific stuff. But the point is that other countries became proxy wars, if you will, over manufacturing, and it's a race to the bottom for the labor. And, there's this struggle between just various countries, right? Because they're contracting out to these places. Yes, tariffs helped at that time keep production in the United States in some ways. And I haven't gone into like automobiles and all that other stuff because I'm focused on the textiles here. So tariffs can be a good thing. And I don't want to say that they are never a good thing, because they could be if they are used well. However, at this time, a lot of the mills that are in the United States are shutting down because they can't compete with the cheaper labor. Like, they didn't go out of business. They just got moved. And so all of the equipment that they have is also going away. A lot of it got sent to Mexico, Honduras. Like, a lot of this machinery went with the jobs. And so that's really important to keep in mind. Also, a lot of that machinery was stuff that was still from the early 1900s that it had been maintained. It was built to last. We're catching up to the nuance I want to talk about, and I'm about to get very specific into current knitting in the United States, what have you. So when the jobs left, so did the equipment. There might be a piece here and there, but nothing like it was. And at the same time, American consumers, they are still buying stuff, right? Like, those jobs left, but in many cases, people just got other different jobs. And that was where, as a whole, generally, not on an individual basis, because everyone's got, anecdotal differences, but generally, the United States started to move from manufacturing into services. The kind of things where you work in a cubicle instead of at a station at a machine. And that's what happened. And then NAFTA, where stuff could freely move between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, 1992, I believe. NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that allowed stuff to move around. Especially that one did affect, like, automobiles. It's still just the way cars are put together. They move around in a lot of ways, crossing borders several times. And textile manufacturing, like, a lot of that went to Mexico. A lot of the equipment and machinery went to Mexico. So here's the thing. When you look at the equipment that left, also the animals left. The sheep left. If you look at where wool comes from, a lot of the wool that we use in the United States, it's coming from Peru, China, Turkey, Australia. Like, those are places where there are mills and large industrial scale usefulness size herds of sheep, like in Wyoming, Montana, places like that. The people who take care of the sheep are migrants. So if you don't have the migrants to do that labor and the knowledge of that work, you don't have anyone to take care of the sheep, what happens? The sheep are culled. So all of these things have happened. In the United States currently, there is one location. It is in Texas. I cannot think offhand what the name of it is, but I'll put it up. And it is the one place that you can send a large quantity of wool, like we're talking a couple bales of wool, to be scoured. It is the only place in the United States that scours wool at that scale. There are a few other small mills like Mountain Meadow in Buffalo, Wyoming, and the one in Nebraska, Brown Sheep Company. There are a lot of, like, not even mini mills, micro mills. These are extraordinarily boutique mills, very small. Like, people are operating them out of their basement or their garage or their, barn out back. When I go to Wisconsin Sheep and Wool Festival, there's a lot of those mill owners there with their products, and it's really cool, and you can shop there and stuff. But the thing is, they are extraordinarily niche. They are extraordinarily boutique and artisan, and their prices are high. People pay those prices because we understand that we are investing in keeping that alive. But, like, we do that because we're knowledgeable about it, not because we need clothes for our kids to go back to school, right? Does that make sense? Like people invest and purchase wool from these local mini tiny mills because we understand the importance of having a mill that is local. However, to say that all the people who need to buy clothes for their kids going back to school are going to be able to access yarn at an affordable price, that is milled and, scoured, spun, woven, and sewn in the United States, that's not even possible. We don't have the scale to scour the sheep. I mean, back up. We don't have the sheep. We don't have the shearers. Shearing is an incredibly physical job, and it is a very highly skilled job because you can't hurt yourself or the sheep, and you've got this blade going around, and there's just not enough people even to teach new sheep shearers here. And then to take all that wool and put it somewhere, like, to be processed. These micro mills that I'm referring to, like I see at Wisconsin Sheep and Wool, are probably, if you go to Rhinebeck or Maryland or Lambstown or wherever, like, you can find them at wool festivals. They are part of this community. Hi, I see you. But they don't have the capacity. A lot of them are a year out. Like, if I took a couple fleeces to them and said, hey, can you spin these for me? They would say, sure, we'll have it back to you in a year. I even spoke with some mill owners who are more than a year out. Like, you've already sheared the sheep again, and the fleece from last season isn't spun yet because they are that maxed out. Okay, now, I know that some of you are thinking, that's great though, because the tariffs are going to put everything at an equal cost. Like, the overseas stuff isn't going to be, too affordable anymore. So if you've got the choice, you're going to want to buy American and rah patriotism. The equipment that people get, like, a lot of it is, Belfast Mills? That's not an American company, so that has to be imported. Just the startup costs alone to get this thing going. And then what? You put out all this money to increase your capacity, and then do we have tariffs next year? Next week? I mean, at this point, the way, like, there's no future projection to make that kind of an investment. Like, that is so scary and so risky. So, like, where is the investment coming from? Let's talk about just some other things, like all of the indie dyers. I know that there's this, like, Pollyanna attitude right now of supporting the local indie dyers and being aware of where they're sourcing their stuff from. There is such confusion about American companies versus American production, because you can have an American company that is getting their bare yarn, blank yarn from overseas because there aren't enough mills in the United States. That's why we say we have a global economy, because we have moved into a system that is global. And to suddenly exit that system, like, it doesn't work that way anymore. Like, that day is done. That day is gone. Now, if you wanted to bring that back, if you wanted to improve that, there are ways that probably could be done, but not by initially starting with the tariff. It's going to look like more grants to open mills. It's going to look like, reducing costs on bringing in equipment. It's going to look like, incentivizing farmers to grow their flocks by providing the systems and ways that they can have that wool purchased and moved into production systems. And like taking away the labor that maintains those flocks is not the way to do that. Purchasing locally is great. Wonderful. I do that when I can. I love to support local mills. I want people to support their local mills. But let's talk about linen for a second. There is no linen industry in the United States. I know this because I have volunteered with FiberShed, my local FiberShed. There's a whole initiative where they're trying to bring flax production back to Wisconsin because the climate there is great for it. But getting the equipment that the farmers need to harvest the flax, that equipment is too big if you get it from Belgium or the places that have very large flax and linen production. That equipment is too big. And so what they're looking at to bring in is like antique stuff because it's smaller. And then you also have to have farmers that are willing to give up part of their land that they're probably using for some other profitable endeavor over to flax to see what happens, right? Like, there needs to be support to get all of that functioning, and slapping tariffs on things coming in from the EU it just means that linen is going to be more expensive. Period. Because we don't make that in the United States, and there's no equipment to make that in the United States. And no, it's not the other countries that are paying it. It's the importer that pays it. I have a shop. I know this. If you purchase something that's coming from overseas, like, the customs are paid by the importer. Those tariffs are part of that customs, and that money is just going to the government. It's paid by the people who imported it, so it's paid by its citizens. So, when citizens are paying money to the government, that's a tax. That's how that works. I also want to acknowledge, Kickstarters. Kickstarters are in trouble. The ones that have their stuff manufactured in China or other countries, because that's where the manufacturing is, and, it has been funded, but the stuff hasn't been shipped in yet. There's a lot of Kickstarters that are going to be in trouble. I supported the Dreaming Robots fold. That's been funded and paid for. But the stuff is being produced in China, and it's not here yet. And there's no option to produce that in the United States because that kind of tailored, specific to spec manufacturing for those types of parts doesn't exist here. That makes it hard to plan for the future and to do the kind of stuff, the kind of projects that take a lot of time to build. All right, so let's talk about the community for a second. If any of you are still with me at this point, I don't know if you are, but there is something that just absolutely breaks my heart. And that is when there are people who show up and say things like, I'm not going to be able to afford acrylic yarn because I'm on a fixed income and I don't know if I'm going to have my Social Security and I don't know if I'm going to have my Medicaid and I'm not going to be able to afford whatever the price is for the acrylic that I use because acrylic is all imported. There's absolutely no manufacture of that in the United States, and so it's all going to have tariffs, and most of it comes from China, which has the most, it's more than double now. So, when people are explaining that situation and the response from other people in this community is, well, just go to Goodwill and unravel a sweater. The lack of compassion, the lack of a willingness to understand that not everybody is in the same circumstance, I think is really gross. And I think that people need to do better. People need to listen, and people need to have empathy and understanding. People need to be aware that the things that are happening right now with the government are not affecting everyone the same. Eventually, everyone will be affected, but it's hitting certain people harder first, and those people are the more vulnerable people. So to dismiss them, to brush them off, to make them feel unheard, you're bullying people. Like, stop. Stop. You know, the solution is not to send someone to Goodwill to unravel sweaters, which, let me tell you, when people don't have, like, you know, the normies, the not fiber people, or maybe some of the fiber people, I don't know, but like when people don't have access to fast fashion at cheap prices, people are not turning over their wardrobes as fast. That means that Goodwill and whatever, you know, thrift shops, they're not going to have the influx of donations that they've had in the past. But these places make money and they don't want to suddenly lose money. So what does that mean? Less supply? Stuff gets more expensive. I've seen a lot of people talk about the tariffs and they're like, make do, everyone. It's just like World War II. Okay, but like countries entering into a war to fight for freedom and to fight white supremacy is different than being in the country that is perpetuating white supremacy and taking away freedoms. This was a choice. We don't have to be doing this. This is not a war effort. This is a travesty of our own making, I guess. And so we're just stuck in this system, but we still have to engage with the world the way it is. And we still have, at least currently, some agency, some power to make some choices, but the way that these tariffs are implemented, the way that costs are going to go up, the way that some companies are not importing things because they can't afford to, you know, that's just less choices. And then also I want to go back to the indie yarn people, right? Like the prices there are already high and the margins there are already a sliver. If you go and just pay any attention to the indie dye community, the number of them that are on the verge of closing up shop on a regular basis, like we are not going to have these small boutique yarn indie dye designers to shop from, because they are going to have to go and get different work to make enough money to pay for the, what is it now? Like we have a 25% tariff on tomatoes. Everything's going to get more expensive. And so like, even if you're getting stuff from the United States without a tariff, there's stuff that you just can't get in the United States. And so you have to pay the tariff. And so your cost of living goes up. But there's not money coming into the economy because people are scared to invest in the economy because they can't project and they can't plan. And that's called stagflation. And so, like, this is a very serious economic situation. And so for the people who are concerned about the news that they're hearing, that it's possible that they aren't going to have money to pay for their life-saving necessary medications or their groceries. The solution is not to tell them to go to Goodwill. The solution is to check on your neighbors. The solution is to create community with mutual aid systems. The solution is to care for your neighbors, not to dismiss them, not to call them a snowflake because they have a different political view than you might. That doesn't get us anywhere. The solution is more community. And so when I see these things come up that just absolutely divide people, especially in the fiber arts community where we have something in common that unites us, something beautiful, to see people going at it like that in the comment sections and chats and stuff breaks my heart. And we can do better. And we're going to have to do better if we're going to get through this together. So if you're not in the United States and you actually listen to this whole thing, I am so sorry that it's like this now. So I will continue making my YouTube videos. I will continue with my tutorials. I will continue teaching you all how to do it yourself. That's not going to go away. We still have our own agency to make things. Ultimately, I find that to be truly rebellious, truly countercultural, truly amazing. So I'm going to encourage all of you to keep spinning, keep on spinning, keep on knitting, keep on crocheting, keep on sewing, all of that stuff, and also check on your neighbors.